Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on inflation and reserves and the implications on capital planning. Today, we're going to have Tanner Oldenburger, our professional engineer and reserve specialist, vice president of engineering here at Reserve Advisors, speak on this timely topic. Before we get started, we do have a couple of poll questions here. So I'm going to launch a poll real quick. If you could take a moment to provide some insight into your association's experience with reserve studies, that'd be greatly appreciated. So go ahead here and stop the poll, Tanner. We can share the results here. So the first question was, has your community had a reserve study in the past 3 years? 89% of attendees have had a reserve study done at their association in the last 3 years. And then the second question geared around how impactful has the economic climate been on your ability to fund capital projects? It looks like about 1/3 of associations, 37%, are experiencing challenges as a result of the current economic climate. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, Tanner. So this leads us into some statistics as we speak to the challenges associations are facing with funding critical capital projects. We've done a review of all the associations that we've worked with, and we found that 87% of condo associations at the time of the latest reserve study were at some level or degree underfunded. So whether that's slightly underfunded to significantly underfunded, what we're really looking at is the annual contribution increase inflationary, or is it more than the standard inflation rate? That's how we define that. And then 75% of HOAs. So this is something that's very relevant to many associations as costs increase and associations are facing higher costs for capital projects. It's going to be more challenging for these associations to fund those projects. We'll go ahead to the next slide, Tanner. Before I turn it over to Tanner here, just wanted to highlight what we'll be covering. So Tanner will be speaking to Consumer Price Index and Producer Price Index, what those are, and which benchmark we utilize from a reserve study perspective. We'll cover some information on the cost of materials and labor, what the current market looks like there. We'll also get into reserve study methodology. So how is a reserve study firm analyzing and taking into consideration these increased costs for material and labor, as well as the inflationary rate in making their assumptions. And then we'll talk about best practices and frequently asked questions for associations that have a reserve study and kind of what that next step would look like, whether they need to update or take another approach to getting updated information for planning purposes. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Tanner.
Sounds good. Thank you, Matt. I appreciate everyone joining this morning. Just quickly introduce myself. I'm a VP of Engineering here at Reserve Advisors. I'm located here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I have my background in civil and structural engineering. I've been working with Reserve Advisors and in the reserve study arena for about 10 years now, working with association boards, managers, with really the same goal the entire time, is to how to fulfill the extremely difficult job all of you have of maintaining your fiduciary duty to protect your communities and your ownership membership. So if you stick around today for the entire presentation, at the end of the presentation, I will reveal what inflation rates will be for the next 15 years. So you can set up and line up your investments and plan your projects to a T. Actually, I won't be doing that today. I do need a disclaimer. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not a global economist, but in the context of what we'll be talking about today with inflation, I will say that my experience and what I've seen over the last 10 years involving with pricing, timing, and the methodology and scope of replacement of tens of thousands of common elements at a community association, what I've been tracking and following for a very long time is where these trends are going. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Starting with first the CPI versus PPI. These are two of the main driving forces that a lot of people look at for inflation drivers in the economic climate. The first one, CPI, Consumer Price Index. This is the measure of retail goods. So this affects industries like food and beverage, transportation, personal goods. The PPI, that's the Producer Price Index. This is a measure of wholesale goods domestically. So that is industries like agriculture, manufacturing, retail, real estate, healthcare, and a lot of what we're talking about today is construction. So Looking down below, if you can look at the 5 and 10-year averages, you can see that construction, labor, and material markets has been on a wild ride the last 5-10 years at a pretty steep incline when comparison to the more steady CPI rate, which is a lot of times what a lot of people will reference when they're talking about inflation will be the CPI. So on this graph here just shows a little bit of that volatility. In the red line there, you can see how PPI dips below and can go negative, and what it's been doing the last couple of years has been on a very, very steep incline. So where PPI can be a good short-term indicator of what inflation is going to be doing on the CPI side, it's really challenging to overreact for a long-term perspective in terms of what PPI is doing in a short window there. I'll touch on that here in a little bit more when we get to the reserve study side. So yeah, CPI showing the more stability over time on what it's doing on the retail side, but you can see PPI over the last 30 years tends to be a lot more constant, stable, and predictable. So everyone on this call, I'm sure, is fully well aware on what has been doing in the labor and materials market over the last few years. This is just showing the annual change over the last year in comparison. I believe this is from September, these numbers, just showing what concrete, plastic construction like vinyl siding, asphalt pavement, what that's doing at these high rates of 10 to 20% year over year. Lumber, what happened in 2020 with lumber shooting through the roof, it's actually stabilized somewhat and come back down. And then on the labor side, contractors for concrete, roofing, maintenance and repair, those are all up at a very high rate over the last couple of years. So in the United States, there's over 360,000 associations. 300,000 of those are over 20 years of age. So a lot of associations getting older, feeling the impact of high cost and inflation, and these projects being a lot more frequent than newer properties that were built in the last 5 or 10 years. So that's a driving force on capital expenditures and how these associations can maintain aging infrastructure. So reserve study methodology, what we're doing here and how we formulate our forecasts when it comes to expenditures. So the big one that holds the most weight is local historical bid database. When we get project costs locally, whatever market we're in, we hold and retain those in our own database. That's important for us to see what's happening locally with labor and materials. But it's also a good driving force to understand what associations on the same street, same neighborhood, same city are doing from the 90s, 80s, 70s, and beyond. That just gives us a good perspective on the approach and the cost for a lot of these projects. We also have some other areas that we're researching. That's RS Means or CostWorks and Marshall and Swift. These are nationwide construction cost databases that we can use to analyze unit costs and how those are changing over time. And then what I touched on earlier is available information from the PPI and CPI from the Bureau of Labor and Statistics is watching that closely. So we don't take just one number and plug that into our studies. We're very much looking at a historical perspective on how we generate these forecasts. One thing I just want to touch on here quickly is inflation as a big driver. It certainly is over the last year or two. There are also other large drivers which drive costs, and inflation is just one piece of the pie. Other things we see as the most areas of deviation would be items like scope of work. We have engineers on staff that are predicting what type of work will need to be done when we're talking about roof replacements, facade, pavement. We're predicting what that scope of work will be, but ultimately when you take on that project, you start peeling back the layers. That scope of work can certainly change based on a number of factors: how it was originally designed, what conditions are showing underneath the top layer of siding, such as that. Economy of scale, how you take on that project. Are you going to take on a third of it over the next 3 years? You're going to take it on in one shot. That's a big cost impact on how you're going to, what that cost that project's going to be. Mobilization, design, management fees, how you're going to manage that project is certainly a big driver and deviation there, as well as seasonality and contractor availability that can certainly impact the cost. And those are other factors, again, that tie into inflation, what that's doing over time. So just a couple of those items to keep in the back of your mind there when looking at your project forecast for the future. So our methodology that we use at Reserve Advisors is we're looking at historical perspectives. We're weighting long-term averages in a number of different areas. We're making sure that what I tell a lot of the association managers and boards that I work with, we're not overreacting to micro trends. We have to still keep a macro trend in perspective when we're looking long range. And I have some examples here that touch on that here in a moment. Near-term project cost adjustments. So if we're not overreacting to a micro trend, we certainly need to capture those near term. So if projects are happening this year, next year, or even a year on and beyond, we're making sure we're accounting for those for what's happening in our current volatility, in the current volatile market in terms of labor and materials. So if a project's happening next year, we're making sure to scale that up at a higher rate to make sure that we're protecting ourselves when that project happens next year, that we're not assuming that things steady out quickly than they potentially could. Which draws into the next one. We're not just dropping current inflation rates for long range plans. I have an example of that here in a moment. Things blow up very, very quickly if you put in 6, 7, 8% into some of these long range plans. So the reason why we're doing a lot of those things is the goal of the reserve study is a few different items, and I've highlighted just a couple of here, but we want to properly plan for the upcoming capital expenditures. When I say near term for associations, a 2 to 3 to 4 year window for these major projects should really be defined as what's on our horizon. What are these big projects? And we should be planning for these in the next 2 to 3, 4 years, as they can be very large and impactful on an association. So we want to make sure we're keeping those in mind, that we're tracking those closely, and that we're forecasting those correctly to make sure that we have stable amount of funds to get through the near term. We also want to minimize the deviation in between study updates. So what I mean by that is when we do updates of reserve studies, we want to make sure that deviation, what I call it the realignment of the roadmap, is minimized. So if we do a reserve study, I tell a lot of people, if we put this on the shelf for 5, 8 years and come back, our course correction could be much more dramatic as opposed to doing an update after 2 or 3 years. And really that's just based on the fact I've been doing this for a very long time. I wish I could predict the future, but the best we can do is take all the information we have available, put together the best plan as possible, and stay on top of it to make sure that we continue to realign that roadmap and cause those deviations to be more minor. Inflation does play a big impact on a number of different studies, but as long as we're making that deviation smaller over time, that can reduce that impact on your updates. So to show an example of this, and I picked the most extreme example here just to drive home the point. I just want to say that off the top that not all associations will see this type of dramatic change when it comes to inflationary increases in terms of what we're showing in our 30-year models. But on the left here, what I'm showing here is a newer building. It's a high-rise building with, I believe, 300 units. We have $41 million forecasted over the next 30 years and a forecasted contribution of $725,000 for next year. That's based on a 3.5% inflation rate, which is close to what we're using for a lot of our markets and construction types. You can see what's driving the study here. When I say driving, that's really the major capital expenditures over the next 30 years. That's happening in the last 5, 8, 10-year window here. That's the main driver of the study. So inflation is playing a very large role in how people today are contributing to plan for those projects. Bring in the sound effects of a ball dropping here of the 8% side on what that dramatic impact does. So that yellow line there is moving that up to an 8% inflation rate over time. You can see the green bars, the contributions rate really steady up over a long period of time. But really the impact I'm looking at is how are homeowners today affected by this? So if we put in 8% inflation today, that's affecting your budget for next year and what homeowners are putting in for. So if we put in an 8% inflation, smoke comes out of my computer, and we're forecasting $108 million over the next 30 years and a $975,000 reserve contribution for 2023. So just changing that inflation assumption, and again, we're doing a very dramatic difference here between 3.5 and 8. That's causing a $530 per unit per month impact just by changing that rate. So again, we want to make sure we're staying as close to that long-term inflation rate over time, but we don't want to necessarily penalize homeowners now by taking an overly conservative approach long-term, and again, overreacting to a micro trend and penalizing our current ownership for what's happening right now in the market. So best practices on the reserve study side, just remember that we want to just review the timeline of capital projects. We want to make sure if we have projects A, B, and C coming, can we handle all three projects at once, or do we need to prioritize these projects? When I look at prioritizing projects, I'm looking at a few things to start with. It's always safety of the building and the residents. It's protecting against water infiltration, which would potentially cause damage to the units or a more costly repair. Moving down the line to things that would be nice to have to be maintained, be things like asphalt pavement. And then you get down to the aesthetic side of aesthetics, which are certainly important for the value of a community. But when I'm looking at prioritizing projects, I usually start with safety and end with aesthetics when it comes to trying to line out these projects. So we're taking a close look at near-term timing, condition assessments. That's another thing that's valuable to look at. Is we had forecasted this piece of equipment to expire in the next few years, but you've maintained it, you've kept up with it, and we can defer the timing of replacement because you've maintained this element in a very good way. So that's another thing, is to make sure that we aren't just looking at a sheet and all these elements are supposed to last 15 years, and because they're at 16 years, replace them all next year. We want to take a close look at all those elements to make sure we're lining those out based on how they're actually working, how they're being serviced, and what the remaining useful life is on those. And then preventive maintenance, that's a very important thing. If we're struggling to keep up with capital projects, are we maintaining our assets to extend the remaining useful life of these elements? That's very, very important. If we are challenged with having to replace them, are we at least maintaining them to make sure that we're not stuck with an emergency or last minute repair or replacement that potentially would go up on the cost significantly? And then funding recommendations. I'm going to use that term again, is realigning the roadmap. We're going to look at your current status, your reserve balance and contributions. We had forecasted you in 2022 to be in this point with this amount of money in the bank and contributing this amount. A lot of times there's deviations where there's more or less. We want to understand, okay, where are we at now and where are we going from here? So updating that cash status is very, very important for us to, again, make sure we can minimize the deviation in between studies. The cash flow critical year projections. When I talked about drivers of a reserve study, this is the critical year in a cash flow. So whether that critical year is happening in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 30 years, when I'm looking at that, that's the potential risk assessment I am looking at for the association. So is the critical balance happening in 2 years? We need to take this very seriously, either increase reserves at a very high rate or plan for a special assessment or a loan, because we're going to run into this project. We don't want to defer this project. We want to make sure we're planning for it. As opposed to 25, 30 years out, our critical year is happening. We have time to realign the roadmap, but the more time that goes over, more time that expires getting closer to that critical year, we have less time to catch up or deviate. In terms of what you're collecting for a reserve contribution, if you could set those closer to adequate funding sooner than later, the deviations for future boards, future managers will be less if you can get on track faster. And that all ties to realigning that roadmap. I promise I won't say roadmap any more times throughout the presentation here. So questions I get most frequently, especially over the last year, should we defer our upcoming capital projects? Tying back to what I just mentioned earlier, it really depends. There are certain projects that you do not want to defer, continue to string along or band-aid repairs, because ultimately the cost of repairs can go up, but the risk of a roof failing, an elevator going down at a surprise time where you have to do an emergency repair, those are things you don't want to necessarily defer. But there are some items where we have this lobby renovation coming up. We have these other projects we know we need to take on. Maybe we can look at deferring that a year or two, much at the displeasure of the unit ownership, but that's what we're going to do to make sure that we're financially stable to be able to handle those capital projects in the near term. So I guess the first answer to this one is it depends, and it really depends, and having an unbiased partner to be able to help you navigate that. We don't have skin in the game whether the lobby gets done as opposed to the roof, so we can really give you a logical perspective to go back to your board and your ownership to defend a lot of these decisions, which are very difficult to make. Is our study we did a year, 2 years from now, is it totally invalid now? I would say not necessarily. We certainly, if you have questions on the impact of things that have happened over the last couple of years or things that are upcoming in the next year or two, reach out to us and we can certainly help with that. It does not mean necessarily to throw that in the trash and completely deviate or disregard recommendations that were given a few years ago, but we are in a period of course correction right now. So I would say ask us and we can tell you what the impacts from a 20, 30, 40,000 foot view look like in terms of where we're at now to compare to where we thought we'd be a couple of years ago. When should we update our study? Should we hold down for a few years and wait till things calm down before we update a reserve study? Just from my perspective on updating and seeing these updates of studies over the last few years, I don't think that's prudent practice to necessarily try to wait out the storm. The reason being is if we wait too long, again, the course correction could be much more dramatic, as if we try to get our hands on what the change over the last few years has done. So not to say, we have to drop everything and update right now, but it's certainly good to take a close look at this and not necessarily defer your timing of updates just because there's volatility in the market. I still think there's a good opportunity to review your financial status. I liken it to other things in your own portfolio financials. Is you want to make sure that you don't just ignore it and put it off to the side. These reserve contributions and your capital planning, this is a huge part of your community. So putting that on the back burner and just pausing for a few years, I struggle to think that we're going to come out on the other side and take a wildly different approach. And I just pretty much answered that same question: is should we wait till inflation goes down? Not necessarily. I do not think that's good practice to wait and see. We should see where we're at right now. And similar to what happened in 2008, 2009, 2010, where inflation dipped below zero and negative, we weren't necessarily putting in negative inflation and giving money back to the homeowners because inflation we're dipping. So we're staying between the guardrails of level acceptability, and we're trying to make sure that we're staying on track along the way. So that's what's important, to just make sure we can stay on track.